Welcome, everyone. I'm Ken Ruscio, for those of you who don't know me, Dean of the Jepson School. And I wanted to welcome all of you and also introduce our guest for this afternoon, Alan Wolfe. Alan is a professor of political science and director of the Boissy Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. I've known Alan for more than a few years now, and I think of him really in three different ways. One is he's an outstanding scholar. He's written a number of books, just to mention a few of them: Who's Keeper, Social Science, and Moral Obligation, a book which really kind of added to, if didn't start, the whole debate over the role of civil society relative to the state and the market. That book was followed by several over the last few years: Marginalized in the Middle, a collection of his essays and publications; One Nation After All, a book that I brought him to the college where I taught before I came to the Jepson School, and I remembered someone in the bookstore saying, well, who is this guy, Alan Wolfe? You think he's going to draw a crowd or anything when he comes? And that Sunday, before he was to appear on a Tuesday at the college, the New York Times Book Review on Sunday featured his book on the front cover. And so I thought we timed that just about right for that last visit. Moral Freedom, The Search for Virtue in a World of Choice. He edited School Choice, The Moral Debate. And most recently has written The Transformation of American Religion, How We Actually Practice Our Faith. Besides being an outstanding scholar, he's an insightful social critic. If you read the New Republic, the Wilson Quarterly, New York Times, Harper's, the Atlantic Monthly, Washington Post, any number of other publications that are in the public arena, you've undoubtedly seen some of Alan Wolfe's essays on some of the most pressing social issues of our day. And I also think of him as an original and very independent thinker. It's hard to talk to him for more than a few minutes and not come away seeing an issue differently than you had beforehand. His commentary on politics, economics, and civil society, his work on the intersection of religion, morality, and cultural values as they relate to public policy issues. It's some of the most original and independent thinking, I think, today in American society. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his latest project on the retreat from greatness. So, Alan, welcome to the University of Richmond and the Jepson School.
Well, thank you so much for that thoughtful introduction. We do indeed go back a number of years, Ken Ruscio and I, and I'm thrilled that he invited me to this extremely exciting place, the Jepson School at the University of Richmond, which I'm very, very impressed. Certainly was quite taken aback, I must say, by the rigor with which I was questioned by the students in the class just before this. And yeah, you know who I'm talking about. So it's been a terrific visit so far, and I'm sure it will continue. I'm going to talk a little bit about American greatness, which is a subject I'm just started to work on recently, and this is really the first opportunity I've had to present these ideas to an audience, so I'll be interested in your reaction. I became interested in this topic because in the early days of the Bush presidency, there was a great deal of talk about greatness. A number of Mr. Bush's advisors, some of the prominent neoconservatives, for example, like William Kristol and others who are, have a certain influence in public discussion these days, said that what we needed was a kind of return to the era of greatness that was associated with presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, who were unapologetic about using American power in the world and who wanted to see a revitalized and a strong America assert its influence throughout the world. And certainly we've seen a president in the last few years who has accepted that America will play a major role in world leadership and is willing and in breaking really with precedent of his immediate predecessors to insist on the deployment of American power in the world without necessarily the help of major allies that have supported those actions in the past. And there is a kind of TR-like quality about the big stick that the Bush administration has been wielding. In fact, once you think about it, there are a number of kind of remarkable similarities between George W. Bush and Theodore Roosevelt. Both were the products of East Coast upbringings in very wealthy and established families. Both didn't find themselves at all until they went to the West and discovered in the West the importance of tradition American kind of masculine emphasis on strength and the willingness to display strength. Both experienced personal crises. For Theodore Roosevelt, it was his asthma, which he overcame by rigorous exercise and conduct. In Mr. Bush's case, it was his temptations with alcoholism, which he overcame by a born-again conversion to Jesus Christ. Both were physical fitness fanatics, if I may use that term, who were very, very vigorous, not only in their conduct of their office, but in their personal being. And these similarities began to suggest to me the necessity to think a little bit more about ideas about American greatness and what they might mean. What was distinctive about Theodore Roosevelt? What was distinctive about other people and politicians and sets of ideas that we usually associate with this notion that America should be a great country willing to demonstrate its power around the world? Well, it seemed to me, to begin with, that at least three elements have to be present for something like American greatness to exist. There, first of all, has to be the willingness to articulate a well-defined vision of the nation, that the nation has to stand for something to be great. That, secondly, the vision alone won't do it. There has to be some capacity in the nation for realizing that vision, for putting it into reality, for making it effective. And thirdly, if that vision is found to be efficacious within the country, there needs to be some demonstration of the importance of extending that vision abroad, and to some degree to trying to organize the world by the same vision with which one organizes the United States. Now, each of these three elements, when you think about it for a while, is actually quite complicated. And the further I thought about it, the more I realized how difficult each of these visions is to achieve, and so consequently, this may help explain why American greatness has actually been, as I'll argue today, much more the exception among our presidents than the rule. Consider, first of all, the question of having some national vision or national purpose that the United States is expected to embody. There are usually two terms that are used to describe what that quality could be: liberty and equality. And yet we've never had any kind of agreement at all throughout our history on what those terms might actually mean. Whatever the founders meant by liberty, it obviously didn't extend to those who were held in bondage at the time the country was founded. If anything, liberty in the first half century of our existence became the rallying cry of Southern politicians determined to protect their way of life, that is, a way of life that accepted slavery, against those who would extend liberty to the slaves. We finally did get the country rid of slavery, as you all know, but the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which followed in the wake of the Civil War, which were presumably extended the liberty to former slaves, actually was interpreted by the Supreme Court in a way that gave liberty much more to corporations than it did to people in the 50 or 60 years after the Civil War concluded. So we've never been clear about what liberty means. And we are unsure to this day whether, in the name of liberty, we can regulate the influence over politicians sought by wealthy campaign contributors, or whether liberty means that we can protect ourselves from spam, or whether we can't. At least we talk frequently about liberty. We don't actually talk as much about equality. To take one example, the words "all men are created equal" has been cited only 23 times by the U.S. Supreme Court in its history, and nearly always in dissent. We did face the issue of equality in the course of the Civil War, And because of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln attempted through his extraordinary prose to flesh out the promise of equality that the Declaration of Independence had only hinted at. But as the novelist Robert Penn Warren realized when he said that the Confederacy was born on the day that Lee handed his sword to Grant at Appomattox, the less attractive meaning of equality over which the Civil War was fought, the one that divided the country by race, and by held one race in an inferior position by the other, it lost the war, but it actually won the peace, as racial segregation proceeded right up through the latter part of the 20th century. So equality is another idea we uphold as a nation, but it's an idea about which we have had enormous disagreements. Now, even if we had been committed around the idea of a sense of national purpose, which is the first requirement of national greatness, we've never accepted and approved with consensus the second, that there must be a mechanism for translating that idea into reality. The idea of the nation itself, the nation that would embody these values, has actually had a contentious history in the United States. Many of our founders did not believe they were creating a nation at all. John C. Calhoun certainly did not believe that the United States was created as a nation, but instead as an assemblage of different states. James Madison, perhaps the greatest mind among our early founders, certainly endorsed the creation of a nation through the Constitution and justified its existence in the Federalist Papers. But he also authored the Virginia Resolution, challenging national sovereignty on behalf of the states. The greatest nationalist of our early period was from this place, from Richmond, Virginia, John Marshall, who certainly of all the thinkers in the American tradition has probably expressed the idea of the American nation most eloquently. I was particularly struck by his language in a case called Cohens versus Virginia, which was decided in 1821. Rejecting a claim by Virginia that its courts were the proper tribunal to hear a case involving the sale of a lottery ticket in the District of Columbia, Marshall wrote, "The United States form a single nation." He went on to say, "We are one people whose national existence is defined by a constitution that is framed for ages to come. State governments have no independent sovereignty," Marshall claimed in this case. "They are instead, quote, constituent parts of the United States, quote, members of our great empire, for some purpose sovereign, for some purpose subordinate." Marshall was challenged by editorialists in the state of Virginia for his nationalism. And he responded to his critics in a letter by saying this, "Have we no national existence? We are charged by the late Emperor of France with having no national character, no actual existence as a nation. But not even he denied our theoretical or constitutional existence." Marshall's nationalism, however, has been the exception rather than the rule in American public life. Certainly Marshall was no Democrat. He was a Federalist, an elitist, and very, very suspicious of the emerging democratic ideas of his age. But at the same time, by positing the idea of a nation, he set in motion the notion that all Americans would eventually become citizens of that nation, because citizens would provide the energy. Energy was a word that Federalists like Alexander Hamilton frequently used in the Federalist Papers that made the nation possible. And so it was really Abraham Lincoln who took the idea of American greatness that Marshall had hinted at and extended it more than probably any other president in the history of the United States. Lincoln's vision of an American nation, he used the word nation 4 times, for example, in the Gettysburg Address, was certainly not Lincoln himself, like Marshall, was certainly not without his flaws. Marshall's idea of the nation was not necessarily a democratic one, and Lincoln's idea of the nation didn't include a great deal of respect for civil liberties. But it is certainly to Lincoln that we owe the idea that a great nation is dependent on a great people, that its greatness lies in the capacity to look beyond recrimination and for a people to redeem itself through ties of mutual obligation. Now, Lincoln's understanding of our nation would be challenged just as Marshall's was challenged by people like John C. Calhoun. This is no nation at all, said Kentucky Senator James Beck in 1875, the same year in which Congress passed the most extensive Civil Rights Act to that point in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Civil Rights Act of 1875 was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and in declaring it unconstitutional, the court used the word nation only once in its entire decision, and that was with reference to France. If a nation is defined by the equal right of all of its citizens to vote for those who lead it, then James Beck of Kentucky was right in 1875 to say that this is no nation, because many American citizens did not have that right. So unable to agree on what our purpose of the United States might be, and unable to agree that it was necessary to form a strong national government with sufficient authority to embody and to realize that purpose, it can hardly be surprising that the third aspect of American greatness, the willingness to believe in the idea of America and to apply that idea abroad, has also been the exception rather than the rule throughout American history. Walter Russell Mead has written a book about American foreign policy in which he identifies 4 different traditions that have guided American foreign policy throughout our history, which he calls the Jeffersonian, the Jacksonian, the Hamiltonian, and the Wilsonian. It's actually a brilliant book, and these different trends and tendencies are very clear. But we have been much more Jeffersonian and Jacksonian in our foreign policy than we have been Hamiltonian and Wilsonian. That is, we don't view the world as ripe for we have traditionally not viewed the world as ripe for the imposition of American principles abroad. We have instead traditionally suspected the world of wanting to impose its alien principles on us. Our leaders did best this tradition of American thinking holds when they kept America pure, not when they engaged its power for uses abroad. Isolationism has been one of the strongest currents in the history of American foreign policy, and isolationism views America as perhaps a great nation, but only a great nation at home. There have been exceptions to this traditional domination of isolationism in American political culture. Perhaps the most important exception were a group of thinkers that the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington calls the neo-Hamiltonians of the late 19th century. These were men like Alfred Thayer Mann, Elihu Root, and John Hay, and others who believed that they had the opportunity to take Alexander Hamilton's notions about a great America and to transform them into an active foreign policy for the United States. That would be, frankly, imperialist in nature. Frankly is here a direct quotation from Alfred Thayer Mann. I am frankly an imperialist, he said, in the sense that I believe that no nation, and certainly no great nation, should henceforth maintain the policy of isolation which fitted our early history. Above all, it should not, on that outlived plea, refuse to intervene in events obviously thrust upon its conscience, he continued. Now, the neo-Hamiltonians like John Marshall, who was not a Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, who had little respect for civil liberty and the conduct of the Civil War, the neo-Hamiltonians were also very flawed individuals. They had little of Lincoln's magnanimity. In their zeal to unify the nation, they were quite intolerant of dissent, and many of their ideas about the American empire had a distinctly racist cast. But they nonetheless did believe that the United States ought to be great in the sense that it ought to stand for something and it ought to be willing to project its power in defense of what it stands for, whatever the cost. Just as Marshall's nationalism never really survived the challenge that was posed to it by the South and by Calhoun, and just as Lincoln's nationalism didn't really become effective until 100 years later in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the neo-Hamiltonians also had a very, very short-term influence on American life. Isolationism returned with a vengeance after they wrote capable of blocking American entry into the League of Nations after World War I, and capable of preventing, for a significant time, American entry into World War II while the rest of Europe was in flames. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we take these three principles, that for America to be great, it has to stand for some great quality, that it has to be willing to take the steps to make that quality realizable at home, and then even be willing to extend that quality abroad in defense of that ideal. If we take those three criteria as constituting American greatness has been far more the exception rather than the rule. If I were to be generous and say, let's include thinkers that subscribe to at least two of those three principles, I would not include on a list of people who stood for the idea of American greatness the following individuals: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John C. Calhoun, Stephen A. Douglas, Henry David Thoreau, William Graham Sumner, William Jennings Bryan, Mark Twain, William James, Louis D. Brandeis, Herbert Hoover, Robert A. Taft, Hugo Black, and, to cite a few contemporary examples, Newt Gingrich, Antonin Scalia, Gore Vidal, and Ralph Nader. Now, all of these people are thoughtful and intelligent. Many, although not all of them, are American patriots. Thoughtful sometimes to the point of brilliance. Many of them are. Good citizens in their own way, they try to be. But they are not people who make American greatness a priority in their thinking and in their life. Because each of them believes in some way that some other principle, some principle other than greatness, ought to take priority. Whether that principle involves the cultivation of Republican virtue, loyalty to a section of the nation rather than to the nation itself, unspoiled nature, which should be protected against civilization, economic freedom or laissez-faire, effective competition, states' rights, isolationism, civil liberties, world peace. There are a number of other competing goods that can stand as more important than American greatness, and for which each of these thinkers, I think, did. On the other hand, if we include in a list people who believe, at least in the first two of these principles, of defining a national idea and seeking to support and strengthen and create that idea in reality, I would include in a list of people who believed in American greatness Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Marshall, Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Charles Sumner, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass, Herbert Crowley, Jane Addams, Albert Beveridge, John Marshall Harlan, both our presidents named Roosevelt, Walter Reuther, Earl Warren, Lyndon Johnson, and again, to mention a few contemporary examples, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Nathan Glazer, James McGregor Burns, if I may, and Diane Ravitch. Now, I put this list together to demonstrate that the belief in American greatness is not an ideological thing. There are liberals and conservatives on both sides of my American greatness divide. There are fathers and sons on both sides with John Adams and John Quincy Adams. There are Republicans and Democrats on both sides, and so on. Greatness cuts across partisan lines, ideological lines, literary lines. I've got novelists and essayists on both sides, and so on. But I do think there has been a dividing line in American politics that in some way has been more important than the dividing line between liberals and conservatives. And that's a dividing line between those who tried to embody a principle of greatness and those who thought that some other quality could perhaps be more important. And I think that principle extends right down to the election taking place today, where within one party you have people, for example, like Howard Dean and Wesley Clark in the same party, who I think have and stand on different sides of this particular issue. Now, having tried to give some kind of definition of what American greatness might mean, I think the next question that I want to address with you is some of the underlying qualities that go into each of these two divisions of the meaning and purpose of American life. Because as I've said, if greatness is not really ideological or partisan, if that's not the real divide, not between liberals and Democrats or Republicans and conservatives, then what does divide people who put, in a sense, American greatness first and those who do not? And I think the questions that are really determinative here are more philosophical questions than they are political questions. They involve questions like these. Are human beings inherently sinful and in need of firm guidance, or are they capable of inherent moral goodness? Should they be allowed to discover what is in their own self-interest, or should their actions be channeled toward pre-chosen ends? Are we best off learning from experience, or ought we to follow the dictates of logic and theory? Is the world in which we find ourselves the proper world for judging our actions, or can we envision other worlds to which we should aspire? Is the present determined by the past, or can one escape the dictates of our history? These, it seems to me, are the questions in which these people in these two schools of thought divide themselves. Let me offer some illustrations. I think one of the most striking contrasts between America's two visions of itself really involves something closer to a psychological disposition than to a political platform. Nations can approach the world warily and with suspicion, or positively and with confidence. And of the two, it has been the former that has dominated American political culture since the time of the Revolution. Our founders were suspicious, of course, of Great Britain, which we broke away from in order to create our own society. But our founders were also suspicious of one party within Great Britain more than the other, and that was the party of the court rather than the party of the country. Historians like Gordon Wood have written extensively about this, that British politics was dominated by a conflict between those who were associated with the court and who practiced the politics of patronage and mutual back-scratching, and those who were outside the court in the country who wanted the politics to be pure and virtuous. And we really inherited, through our tradition of small r republicanism and republican virtue, the suspicion of power, the suspicion of the court, the suspicion of what would become, in the United States, of Washington, D.C., which reverberates right now from the very founding of the United States to a time when politicians who are experienced Washington creatures insist that they're always running against Washington, no matter how long they've lived there. It's an odd peculiarity of American politics that foreigners can never understand, but it is something that influences both our parties and has influenced our politics from the very beginning, and that is this suspicion toward power and the sense that we always have to be wary and suspicious. I see this attitude of suspicion as having contributed to the vision of a smaller America and to have worked against the idea of a greater America. Because a great America requires power, and it requires the use of power. But if one believes that power will always be associated with corruption, and that one needs to protect oneself with purity against the exercise of power, then suspicion rather than greatness will dominate. Andrew Jackson, one of our presidents, was suspicious to the degree of making it into an art form. Andrew Johnson, according to his biographer, was suspicious of everyone. And this description seems to me to be so close to that of Richard Nixon that it's striking, but it's actually about Andrew Johnson. He brooded over the wrongs, real and imaginary, which were thoughtlessly foisted upon him by his social betters. And out of his inner world of suspicious fantasy, he evolved an extravagant credo of plebeian democracy and honest toil. That's been like a theme throughout our culture, a suspicion of power, suspicion of other people's motives, a kind of defensive hunkering in rather than a sense in confidence that power was not necessarily bad and that people could do good things with it. A very, very influential essay written in 1955 by Cecilia Kenyon dealt with the worldview of the anti-federalists in the United States. And she read their literature, and she said that throughout the course of literature, she found words like these: the natural lust of power so inherent in man, the predominant thirst of domination which has invariably and uniformly prompted rulers to abuse their power, to what another pamphlet called the ambition of man and his lust for domination. Another one wrote about men of like passions who have the same inherent thirst for power with ourselves. Another, besides suspicion, another feature, it seems to me, that differentiates the small from the large vision of America is a theory about human nature that associated with the small America vision is an idea that human nature is inherently sinful, inherently tending toward corruption, that can never really be altered. Beneath the surface of civilization, there lay, for many American thinkers, human beings who behaved like famished, infuriated animals, goaded by instinct and unrestrained by protective hopes and fears. That quote is from a clergyman, Lyman Beecher, written in the 1830s. For men like Lyman Beecher, the true theorist of the state was neither Hobbes nor Locke, but John Calvin. If a capricious God was capable of doing little to transform the human propensity to sin, then surely government could do even less. Daniel Walker Howe, a historian at UCLA, has described the Democrats and some of the Whigs of the early 19th century as holding to a theology, a political theology he called political premillennialism, that human beings were so stained by sin that no hope was possible in this world, and that only after the millennium could people ever be trusted, if indeed even there. So you have, it seems to me, associated with one school of American political thought and culture, this highly pessimistic, highly negative view of human potential and human capacity. Not all of our founders felt that way. James Madison, probably his most famous quote is from the Federalist: "If all men were angels, no government would be necessary." But having concluded that men were not angels, Madison did not conclude that they were devils. He said this in the Federalist Papers as well. He said, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumcision and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify esteem and confidence." Confidence was one of Alexander Hamilton's favorite words. He wrote a letter to the New York State Ratifying Convention, which was deciding whether to ratify the Constitution in 1788. And he said, "When you have divided and nicely balanced the departments of government, when you have strongly connected the virtue of rulers with interest, when you have rendered your system as perfect as human forms can be, you must place confidence, you must give power." In Federalist number 78, Hamilton wrote, "The supposition of a universal venality in human nature is little less an error in political reasoning than the supposition of universal rectitude. The institution of delegated power implies that there is a portion of virtue and honor among mankind, which may be a reasonable foundation of confidence. And experience justifies the theory." So here it seems to me we have a classic divide in American political culture between those who are pessimistic about human nature, suspicious of human capacity, and those who speak about confidence, a willingness to meet the world on its own terms, to go forward, and to use power if necessary. That latter form, it seems to me, has been associated with almost all of the individuals and thinkers I've called adherents to the principle of American greatness. Herbert Croly, whose book, The Promise of American Life, was inspired by Theodore Roosevelt, a book which still makes wonderful reading today, called this book The Promise of American Life to illustrate that we did have human capacities to achieve what we wanted. Croly wrote of Jefferson that, quote, "He believed theoretically in human goodness, but in actual practice his faith in human nature was exceedingly restricted." Croly would have nothing to do with such Jeffersonian restrictions. He called upon Theodore Roosevelt, who he was advising in the book, to reject a democracy of suspicious discontent, of selfish claims, of factious agitation, and of individual and class aggression. We should have a salutary and formative democratic purpose, he wrote in The Promise of American Life. This is a positive and an aspiring language rather than a negative and hell and damnation language. The progressive movement in America was enormously confidence-inspiring in that sense. In 1901, a Methodist minister from Indiana said that what we needed to do in the United States was to bring to the home, to social customs, to the organization of industries, to education, to government, to diplomacy, to literature and the fine arts, to the correction of social evils, as well as to the eternal welfare of human hearts. In other words, progressives believed that human beings were reformable, that they could be reformed in all of their aspects, from their individual lives to their social lives to their institutional lives. This sense of what later generations would denigrate by the derogatory term, the power of positive thinking, runs throughout the people who insisted that the United States could stand for great principles. There's another division between these two camps that I find really fascinating, and it concerns the question of how we should be guided in our actions. Should we be guided by experience, or should our decisions be calculated from a theory and be guided by a theory or by a set of principles? And invariably, people who are suspicious of the idea of greatness were adherent to the idea that our actions should be guided by principle. Perhaps America's greatest political thinker was John C. Calhoun, who invented an entire political theory and constitutional order designed to ensure that the national government would never develop sufficient authority to impose its will on the people of the states. Now, say what you will about Calhoun, about his apologetics for slavery, he was a man who stood on principle. He wrote in a letter to his friend Bowlinghall in 1831, "I would do anything for the Union except to surrender my principles." Principles are essential to the vision of a smaller America. A rejection of the idea that we should be guided in an ad hoc fashion by experience, but instead guided by the idea that we should deduce our actions from larger systematic theory. Abstraction, a belief in abstraction. Andrew Johnson's biographer says that the texture of Johnson's mind was essentially abstract. Concrete problems never had the power to engage his interests that principles had. The principles of equal rights, local self-rule, states' rights, strict constitutionalism, served him well throughout all the vicissitudes and had taken on a mystic powers with the passage of the years. Principles derived from laissez-faire, principles derived from biblical literalism, principles derived from the idea that the Constitution means only what its originators said it meant. A rejection of the idea of interpretation, a rejection of the idea of flexibility, but an insistence on firm principles fashioned at one point in time and valid for all of experience, never to be changed, it seems to me has been one consistent theme in one of these camps. For the other camp, the camp in which I put the Roosevelts and Lincoln and Marshall and so on, the idea is much more to reject systematic theory and to rely on experiment and experience. None more so than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, often described by all of his aides as the great experimenter, a man who did no taste for theory, no taste for systematic principle. He wanted to know what would work, can I make it work, can I apply it to work, and so on. Inconsistent in many of his ideas, ran for campaign on one thing governed by something else. Someone constantly looking for something that would work in society rather than for something that would conform to a systematic theory. I also tend to distinguish between what I would call a romantic tradition in American political culture and a realistic tradition in American political culture. While it's often difficult to think of politicians as being guided by what are essentially literary terms, which refer to movements in the way music is written and novels are composed, the Romantic tradition has traditionally been stood on the smaller version of the American experience, and the realistic tradition on the larger one. By Romantic, I think of people like Andrew Jackson, very much president in the United States at a time when the Romantic movement was a major force in literature and in music in Europe. And just like the Romantic composers in Europe, who were breaking with classical forms in order to develop an ethnic music, a music that recognized through music the authenticity of popular cultures, Andrew Jackson's populism was very rooted in ethnic consciousness, in a kind of romantic, almost neo-feudal vision of the world, in which such romantic ideals as honor and chivalry and defense of the locality would play a role, in which violence was seen as having a purifying effect, a kind of rejection of the aristocratic court as artificial, a Rousseauian vision of the genuine authenticity of people, a rejection really of civilization as an artifice, of civilization as something that is too refined, too sophisticated to capture the real and genuine essence of the folk, of the people. The Romantic tradition has all of those kinds of characteristics, and also has run, I think, very, very remarkably throughout our political history. Romantics tend to share all of the other characteristics that I've been describing. They tend to be suspicious of human motive. They tend to be suspicious of artifice, suspicion of civilization, and guided really by abstract considerations of what people ought to do. In contrast stands the realist tradition. The realist literary figures who want to paint reality as it is, who write novels that are designed to show reality as it actually is. Realism is a very, very different set of literary propositions than Romanticism, and also a very different set of political propositions than Romanticism. The realist takes the world as it is and doesn't seek to impose a romantic vision upon it, but wants to work with the existing materials to fashion it as best as it can into American interests. We have had great realists in the American political tradition, especially foreign policy realists, because the term realist generally applies to a particular tradition in the making of foreign policy. The strongest and most influential realists in our culture have had Germanic names: Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, Henry Kissinger. In many ways, they brought something alien to the United States with their realism. Realism has been a European import to the native folk romantic culture that has been the dominant culture, the dominant expression of American political culture. We can really see, I think, realism as something alien to the United States in that sense, alien to our culture at least, but nevertheless brought here in order to make Americans aware of the fact that the language of good and evil, as appropriate as it may be for literary work, is not an appropriate language for the making of foreign policy. The main claims that realists make is that you have to be guided by the way the world actually is and not by the way that you want it to be. And while certainly there is good and evil in the world, when realistic considerations mean that you have to ally yourselves with someone you may believe that is evil and oppose someone that you may believe is good, in the interests of the nation state, that is what you must do. And it runs very, very counter to the purifying romanticist idea that America embodies a moral good, that good is corrupted by European imports, and that we should operate out of a kind of Native American instinct in this area. Realists might seem to share the kind of pessimistic view of human nature, but they in fact did not. Niebuhr is a particularly good example, a person who had an enormous impact upon American realist thought. Niebuhr was an Augustinian. St. Augustine himself was relatively hopeful with respect to the question of human nature. and so was Niebuhr. Because while I think we tend to think of the realists as Hobbesians in their suspicion toward human nature, they really are not, because they see the world as amenable. They see the world as changeable. They're certainly not utopians, but nor are they cynics. They think that there are materials that can be fashioned to organize around the realization of power, and are willing to do that. Now, what I've tried to do in the second part of the talk, then, is to identify some of the dispositions that underlie the two visions of American greatness that I tried to define in the first part of the talk. To summarize, and then I'll make one more major point before concluding, we've had these two traditions. One says that for America to be a great country, it has to have an ideal that it stands for, it has to be willing to assemble power to achieve that ideal, and it has to be willing to project that power abroad. That vision of the United States tends to lean toward a realist understanding of the world. It tends to lean to a confident and optimistic understanding about human nature and human purpose. The other vision says that any attempt to do those things, to define an ideal, to achieve the power necessary for realizing it, and to extend it abroad, constitutes dangers that we should be aware of, is not the proper American way to do things. We should instead be suspicious of concentrated power. We should think of the local community or the full community as more important than the nation state. That ideal tends to be more romantic in its implication, tends to be guided by a belief in human sinfulness, relatively pessimistic about what people can achieve, and so on. If we apply these ideas to the current situation, what are we to make of the comparison between Theodore Roosevelt and George W. Bush, which is where, after all, I began? I said certainly that there are similarities, that they have very, very similar biographies in many ways, actually remarkably similar. How many children of famous patrician families on the East Coast, after all, reject their upbringing, move to another part of the country, and reinvigorate themselves through a personal crisis that they overcome by the sheer stint of their own efforts. And yet it ought to be obvious that there are dramatic differences between them. Roosevelt was a progressive, Theodore Roosevelt. He was a trust buster. He did not believe in rewarding the already rich and powerful with even more rich and powerful rewards. He was also a conservationist. He put a man named Gifford Pinchot in charge of the National Forest and National Park system, was responsible for creating a number of our national parks. What we now call environmentalism or an ecological consciousness was very much part of the Roosevelt administration's agenda. He actually supported tax increases. He realized that the creation of an American empire would be expensive, that people would have to pay for it. He put himself in the line of fire by charging up San Juan Hill in comparison to some other politicians who put on flight suits and appear on aircraft carriers. So there are, it seems to me, both similarities and differences. Where would we then, if we were a future historian looking back on the Bush years, what would we conclude about these years? Were these years to reverberate with the tradition of Theodore Roosevelt, with the mobilization of power for the achievement of great ideals, or the opposite? Case would probably be made either way. Certainly, the president will use Rooseveltian language when he talks about the extension of democracy to the Middle East. And you can hear in his language echoes of themes of American greatness that have reverberated throughout our history. And I can certainly understand why some people who study these things with great interest have hopes that the Bush administration may return us to the days when people spoke unabashedly about American greatness. But I conclude the opposite. I conclude that the Bush administration, when you think about the various characteristics that I've been using, falls dramatically and clearly within the small America tradition rather than the great America tradition on almost all of the defining characteristics that I've been trying to describe. One way to think about this is to think about history, for example. Theodore Roosevelt was president of the American Historical Association, which is an organization of professional historians. Roosevelt did that because he was a historian himself. He achieved a great deal of fame by writing books of history, some of which are still read to this day, and had a great interest in the history of the United States. People who have a historical consciousness inevitably pay homage to what Abraham Lincoln called the mystic chains of memory in one of his most famous speeches. They see the United States as embodying the realization of a historical ideal. Roosevelt was the first president, Teddy Roosevelt, to create a national archive in the United States for the repository of historical documents. And he paid considerable attention to a question that's very, very important for the city of Richmond, Virginia, to public monuments and where public monuments should be located and how they should be displayed. I don't think a major public monument is ever going to be built for George W. Bush. And I think that's because of all the American presidents of the contemporary world, this president has the least interest in history and in American history of any I've ever seen. Richard Nixon considered himself an amateur historian. Other presidents, John F. Kennedy, considered themselves amateur historians. Almost all presidents, whether they had inclinations toward writing history themselves, have recognized the importance of putting their papers in historical archives and in libraries where they would be accessible to the general public. Now we have an administration that rejects the claims of all of its predecessors, that looks back in American history only to find examples of what not to do, that says that we have to engage in radical new actions because the old actions no longer work. Break with tradition, certainly break with our foreign policy tradition, break with our tradition of environmental protection in many ways. A president who himself had told Brett Hume, the television interviewer, that he doesn't read newspapers, therefore highly unlikely that he will read works of historical analysis, that he prefers instead to rely on summaries provided by his office. Even the most popular history, the history that we associate with, say, Stephen Ambrose and so on, it's difficult to imagine this president reading. And I think that tells me a great deal about American greatness, that you have to have a sense of the history of your country, and you have to see yourself as part of the historical stream of your country to recognize what has been great about it and to extend that greatness to the country as a whole. I have no doubt that Mr. Bush is an enormously forceful leader. He is even among some quarters a very popular leader. He may, for all I know, get reelected. I'm not in the business of predicting those things. Certainly, I've been stunned by his political skills. He is one of the most effective politicians that has ever appeared in Washington. His ability to get what he wants through Congress is truly remarkable. He has gotten what almost no presidents in our recent history have been able to get, which is control of all branches of government. He has a degree of ability to shape the United States in the direction he chooses that is really unprecedented in recent years. Yet nonetheless, all of those things do not make for a vision of the great United States. In fact, when I hear Mr. Bush speak, I hear all of those things I've tried to describe today as embodying the small America view of the world. I hear suspicion about human nature and an unwillingness to believe that human beings are really capacious and generous and compassionate creatures who can overcome their self-interest for the sake of the common good. Instead, I hear a commitment to a very, very restrictive language of economic self-interest as ruling the world, and as goodness and compassion only coming as a byproduct of the inherent selfishness of human beings. When I hear Mr. Bush's choice for Attorney General speak about sin out of his deep evangelical commitments, I hear 19th century religious language about how stained we are by our sinful nature and how unable we are to rise above that and to know what is right in our own language. When I think about the hope-filled language of the Kennedy administration and even the Reagan administration, I see that that has no place in the worldview of men like Vice President Dick Cheney, who are convinced that forces of darkness rule the world and must be met head-on with resolve. Suspicion and fear guide the Bush administration, not confidence and generality. This is also a romantic administration, an administration that really believes that good and evil are appropriate categories for the making of foreign policy, and that has rejected the realism of our best foreign policy accomplishments in the past. This is an administration that has more in common with Woodrow Wilson's idealism than it does with Richard Nixon's Kissinger-inspired realism. But unlike Woodrow Wilson, whose idealism was for the world as a whole, this is an idealism only for the United States. We create the better world, then everyone else shares it. It is Wilson's idealism without Wilson's multilateralism. It's romantic in its sense that all we had to do was topple Saddam Hussein from power, and then a new world of democracy modeled on America would follow. Unprepared to recognize, I think, the complications of trying to apply the language of good and evil to foreign policy. Now, the one thing that I talked about that may not apply to the Bush administration is the adherence to systematic principle. This does not seem to be an administration guided by principle. Mr. Bush talks about rolling back government but expands it, and is very, very adept at pushing through policies that seem to violate some of the beliefs that he asserts at one point in time or another. But it is, oddly enough, a remarkably dogmatic administration, adhering to a theory without really having the theory. It imposes a kind of libertarianism on the poor, and by telling them that they have to live by the iron laws of the market, but violates that logic for its own campaign contributors and the wealthy by creating a form of government socialism for that. In a sense, as political scientist Alan Schick points out, Mr. Bush is the exact opposite of Ronald Reagan. For Ronald Reagan talked a great deal about supply-side economics, but never actually cut popular programs, while Mr. Bush insists that he's a compassionate conservative and yet cuts those programs very, very dramatically. Now, the oddest thing I find about this administration's suspicions, about its unwillingness to reach and extend for a conception of American greatness, is that it all seems so unnecessary. No one ever thought that Abraham Lincoln was going to be a great president. The circumstances of his assumption of the office were anything but ones leading to greatness. No one ever thought that Franklin Roosevelt was going to be a great president. He seemed like a rich, frivolous playboy when he assumed the office. Each became great because they responded to a crisis that was imposed upon them. The Civil War, obviously, in Lincoln's case. World War II and the Great Depression, in Roosevelt's case. September 11th fit those circumstances perfectly. It was an opportunity for a relatively unread, inexperienced man holding office, like a Harry Truman, to rise to the occasion, to unite Americans together, to say that while we have our differences in this country, those differences pale in comparison to the fact that our enemies hate us and that our enemies are willing to go to great lengths to destroy us. While no one should ever say that September 11th was a good thing, it was, in that sense, an opportunity. It created really for the first time an opportunity for a president to say, all this talk about culture wars and divisions and red states and blue states, that's all behind us. I'm the president of the entire country. We have these enemies. It is time for us to unify. Instead, we've had the most polarized, the most divisive administration that anyone in recent memory can recall. I think it's a great shame, personally, that this is what it's come to. I can only wonder what John Marshall, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt would think if they were alive today and saw what I've been describing to you. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. And one class has to go back to some of the presentations.
No, you all agree, so. Go ahead. You've asked me questions before today. Yeah, I certainly, well, I don't make foreign policy, so, you know, I don't have to answer that. But I do think that the realist tradition in foreign policy has been more beneficial than the other. You know, I think that obviously there are limits to realism. You don't want to get yourself in bed with the most horrendous and the worst kinds of people. So, you know, realism just can't be applied as a kind of formula that if you're a realist, this, and this follows. But I do think you have to understand that, or at least if I were in this position of responsibility, to understand that you can't go it alone on these kinds of things, that the nature of the world has changed, and while American military power is enormous and could be used unilaterally, I think a realist would have recognized that we could have accomplished the same objective in Iraq in a way that would have had much broader international support, and that would have been the more realistic course. And I think we certainly see that now in the aftermath of what happened when we are so strapped for support in the rebuilding of Iraq, which of course turned out to be much more complicated than I think romantics like Donald Rumsfeld or Paul Wolfowitz ever recognized it would be. Boy, could we use a certain realism now. And I think that the ultimate proof of that is that we are, by force of circumstance, being transformed in a realist direction in Iraq, because it didn't work, what we tried to do. It just didn't work. Now we're going back to the United Nations, where we should have been in the first place. Finally, just trying to do something that can put some kind of lid on the chaos that our actions have provoked. Yes. I'm very surprised, like many people, by Colin Powell. He certainly, the Powell Doctrine, as it was called, was a realist doctrine, the Weinberger Doctrine. I mean, actually, I was going to go into this in the talk, but didn't, so I'll use your credit. I mean, it's actually, in recent years, the Republican Party has adopted a position in when Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Colin Powell, when he was National Security Advisor, of specifying the conditions under which American power should project itself abroad. And they were pretty realistic conditions. There should be support for it in the international community. It should involve a minimal commitment of American troops. And I think the most interesting, Weinberger listed 6 points in the Weinberger Doctrine of when American power should be projected. And the 6th one was there always must be an exit strategy. And this is one without an exit strategy. No one seems to know. I mean, no one. I don't know any American foreign policy thinker or politician who knows what we should really do now. We've gotten ourselves into such a situation that there is no exit strategy. That's a nice optimistic thought for you.
I'm wondering why, it seems to me that when you talk about greater America and sort of small America, that this President Bush talks a lot about freedom as his vision of America's greatness, which is we're free, and that's his kind of unifying philosophy. And that if you think about it that way, it needs your vision, which he has one vision of the United States. He has a kind of plan right now, and he wants to project that vision abroad, which is to say, bring freedom to the Iraqi people. He talks about that as a rationale all the time. I'm wondering why is not freedom, as the president today sees it, an organizing principle of greatness in your kind of definition?
Well, actually, I think it could be if you were really willing to make that commitment to freedom in Iraq. I think it's a good question, but it seems to me he's not. That right now the consideration is to get the troops out of there before the election. The neoconservatives, let's put it this way, I think if I could reinterpret your question, the neoconservative vision is in some ways an American greatness vision. I mean, I started there. That's the Crystals and the people like that. It does include this commitment to defining an American value, to projecting it abroad, and to sticking the course. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing, oh my God, it became more complicated than we realized. There are 535 bodies right now. There's an election campaign coming up. We got to do something about that, whatever it is. And so I'd be much more sympathetic to that point of view if I saw some real follow-through on it. I'd also be more sympathetic to that point of view if I saw that there was some effort to develop at home a consistent idea about freedom and what freedom might mean, and to realize it. If freedom just means we're going to eliminate the tax code and let anybody sort of do what they want, I guess you could say that's a vision of freedom and consistent, but then I'd say, is that an adequate vision of freedom? And shouldn't we really be talking about what freedom means in terms of the capacity to be free, and that have a kind of discussion or a debate about freedom. But I'm not opposed to classifying Mr. Bush in this category if he were to take the actions that would put him there. I just don't think he has.
You said for American greatness, we realized that we have to have a projection of power. And for me, that struck me as military
Yeah.
historically. What about a peaceful means such as JFK's the Peace Corps, or something along the more idealistic aid side?
Well, I think that can certainly be part of it, and I think it should be part of it. But I also think you can't ignore the military side. I think, while I've personally been somewhat disappointed in General Clark's candidacy, General Clark's career stands for the use of military power to protect and promote human rights abroad. In that sense, it stands for a kind of realization that if we believe in freedom, and that if there are dictators in the world that are depriving people of that by supporting things like genocide and ethnic cleansing, as Slobodan Milosevic was doing, then we have to use our military power on the benefit to achieve that good. And that's an idea, it could be called liberal imperialist, I don't know. There are thinkers on the left end of the political spectrum, such as Samantha Power and Michael Ignatieff, who've been developing this idea. I think there's something, it's an idea I support. I think we ought to be using American military power to protect fundamental human rights abroad in circumstances where we can use it and where we would be effective. And that would include Iraq, which I am not an opponent of the war. I'm an opponent of the way the war was conducted, but not of the war itself and the idea behind the war. Now, having said that, if we're going to do that, then I absolutely think you're right. I think if it's just done militarily, it's not enough, and it needs to be done with other kinds of venues and other kinds of interests. I didn't talk about my work on religion today, but I do a lot of work around religion, and I've been working with the U.S. State Department on public outreach programs to Muslims. And while I think that if we're talking about a hatred of the United States in the Islamic world that is a threat to our security, we clearly will have to use the military option perhaps again, but we should also be thinking about aggressive, self-confident promotion of our way of life in the Muslim world. And that would be peaceful, and that would be based on exchange of ideas and education. And I'd be a big supporter of what's called public diplomacy. But public diplomacy right now is getting relatively short shrift in our foreign policy.
Well, as I mentioned early on, I thought Professor Wolfe was one of the most original independent thinkers I've ever run across, and certainly today. He caught my attention early on when he created a category that included Justice Scalia and Ralph Nader. It made sense.
That was intentional.
So join me in thanking Professor Wolfe, and I'm sure
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, actually, that's the purpose of it. I think a little bit. I have sort of have a chapter on why conservatives gave up the idea of greatness and why liberals gave up the idea of greatness. And then